Alright, let's do issue 2 of Killer Fool, part 2 of 10. Steve Gerber's quite depressing series about decay. Everything decays. Society has decayed. People decay. Morality decays. Everything that is made to decay. I don't like this cover because it doesn't happen in the issue. This happens in the third issue. The central piece of this one is a televised interview with institutionalized serial killer Joaquin Phoenix, the murdering vigilante known as Killer Fool. So for this video, I will be doing a detailed history of him, even though this interview does the exact same thing. What we haven't mentioned yet is that Joaquin Phoenix is not the original Killer Fool. He is the second. The original is summarised here. I will talk about him in a future issue, maybe. I don't think it is ever really that relevant to this story. He was a lot more spiritual, a preacher, a faith healer, an evangelist. He thought he was cleansing the world of sin and purifying society. He hated the smelly pacifist hippies. He was a one-off villain in a couple of Swamp Thing issues. He went up against the title star and some of the supporting characters. The OG Killer Fool, Robert Pupkin, he had a very powerful disintegration ray gun, and he would slay those that he considered to be sinners and infidels. In his own words, fools. It was all religious fanaticism with Robert Pupkin. From the get-go, we always had the idea at play that were Killer Fool ever to judge himself, he too would fit his criteria of fool. Another important thing, this issue doesn't mention it, but it is important to all the Killer Fools. They had calling cards, e pluribus unum. The original Killer Fool, Robert Pupkin, he died and then was emulated by Joaquin Phoenix. I do think maybe Steve Gerber was more interested in Robert Pupkin's history because Robert Pupkin was Steve Gerber's character, whereas this one, Joaquin Phoenix, wasn't, and most of his appearances were written by other writers. Steve Gerber does discuss and explore how Joaquin Phoenix did away with the religious bent of the original Killer Fool in favour of a more poetic brand of simply considering a person to be a fool by their actions or intentions. Before I move on to Joaquin Phoenix, I need to say Robert Pupkin also appeared briefly as a denizen of hell in an issue of Thunderbows. I do like the tone of this interview. It is dismissive of the existence of Swamp Thing. It's, like much of the series is, hauntingly accurate to the sort of biased reporting and interviewing of celebrity figures we have suffered in the years since this. Did you see that interview with Jonathan Majors, for fuck's sake? It was like something from The Boys. Made me yearn for the days of Michael Richards's apology on Letterman, where the audience are laughing because they think it is a bit. Our story behind the second Killer Fool. This was what Steve Gerber contributed to him, and what we cover on these 2 pages. Joaquin Phoenix was in prison alongside Steve Gerber's author analogue Richard Rory, and he was told of these stories of Robert Pupkin, Killer Fool, and upon release Joaquin Phoenix took the identity on himself and reinvented it a tad. We quickly skip over his past encounters with superheroes like the Defenders or Spider-Man. Maybe that is an intentional decision to try and ground this series as much as it can. It's meant to be quite a realistic story. But I also observed it as Steve Gerber shying away from really talking about stories not by him. Joaquin Phoenix was introduced in Orgasmo, which is a Steve Gerber series. A beguiling curiosity that I cannot really explain. However, this Killer Fool was actually from a fill-in issue written by Royce Sternum. Royce Sternum was brought on to write an issue of Orgasmo, and I think people might assume this was all an assignment, or that he was told what to script, that it was Steve Gerber who wanted to introduce a new Killer Fool. But it was actually Royce Sternum. He kicked around the idea of bringing in a new Killer Fool, adding a new Killer Fool into the mix. He liked the original, and obviously Killer Fool was an odd Steve Gerber character, and Steve Gerber must have been okay with that and into the idea, because in the next issue Steve Gerber does build on and continue that. We find out all this backstory, how it is Joaquin Phoenix, a friend of Richard Rory, and how he was inspired by stories of Robert Pupkin. What I like about those comics is that we spend some time setting up Killer Fool, this new Killer Fool, Joaquin Phoenix. And then there isn't any real payoff. It feels like a pure Steve Gerber non sequitur, but unintentionally. The series was cancelled without ever really doing much with Killer Fool. He appears at the end of issue 9, he executes Blockbuster, a supervillain that Orgasmo is fighting, and the next issue blurb promises more on Killer Fool, which we never get. The final issue does not continue on from this, and Killer Fool does not appear in it. It too ends with a different cliffhanger of unresolved promise. One of my subscribers, Steve-O, he enjoys this series. A lot of people do. Rightfully, it is brilliant. But he is one of many who continue to wonder how it happens. It is such an oddball prospect with seemingly limited appeal, and we all want to make sense of things. We want things to be understandable. We want to know why something was made, why something happens. Why are we getting a Killer Fool series in 1991 by Steve Gerber? I have always thought it was a case of a Marvel editor running down a list of Steve Gerber characters to see which he felt like writing again, and they got so far down the list it was on to Killer Fool. Having looked back now though, I wonder if that ending to issue 9 of Orgasmo was a factor. That was a tease for more of Steve Gerber's Killer Fool, which we never got, unlike Orgasmo, whose story was handed to other writers to unsuccessfully attempt to provide definitive closure to. Killer Fool was still around. Other writers had handled them since, but nobody had dramatically shifted them or changed them. And while we are not getting the Joaquin Phoenix's shame that the next issue blurb teased, we are getting to see Steve Gerber providing more on Joaquin Phoenix. Of course, Joaquin Phoenix isn't the protagonist of this story. The protagonist is suffering everyman Defense, played by Michael Douglas. He has been victim to gang violence and crushing defeat after crushing defeat. And viewing this interview with Joaquin Phoenix on TV, it has inspired him, much the same way that Joaquin Phoenix was once inspired by stories of Robert Pupkin's crusade against heretics. And what ends up happening is correspondence begins between our two central characters. In a nutshell, we are seeing the influence of Joaquin Phoenix, the direct influence, with him vicariously using Defense as a surrogate to continue his mission. It's all very good. This series has a lot to say. It is victim of having that feeling of, I've seen it all before, but this was before most of what you are thinking of. Joaquin Phoenix, I would consider him the title star. He is not the protagonist, but he is the title star. He is the killer fool that the title refers to. Defense is his accomplice, his imitator, the protagonist. But the first issue, for example, the killer fool on that cover, is clearly Joaquin Phoenix. I do have more appearances of Joaquin Phoenix to explain. He is incredibly deceptive and cunning in this, very well written. Following Orgasmo, Killer Fool's next appearance was in a bunch of issues of Defenders. He was tied in with that abominable Lobo plotline. He had decided that Lobo was a fool who needed killing. That never happens. Killer Fool never meets a Lobo, but he does befriend Dollar Bill, who brings him to meet the Defenders. For all of a second, the Defenders consider allowing him onto the team, until Killer Fool decides Velcro is a fool for not employing lethal force and choosing not to slay her enemies with her swords. The subsequent fight between the Defenders and Killer Fool wrecks Batman's ranch, which was the then headquarters for the team, and later headquarters for the Thunderbirds for 2 issues. It is not a very good story or showing for Joaquin Phoenix. He gets beaten badly by the cat. and then beaten even more badly by Velcro. He seems allergic to using his very powerful gun in that one. That story ends too with a teaser for a resolution of Orgasmo. What follows, however, is one of my favourite stories with the Killer Fool character. Royce Sternum began using him in Spider-Man. In his civilian identity as Joaquin Phoenix, he became a supporting character. He enrolls at college and is one of Peter Parker's students. Peter Parker was teaching chemistry at the time. If you didn't know who he was, we slowly build to the reveal with hints that he is a bit unusual, a bit odd, very tense. He often sets off Spider-Man's spider sense. But his friendship with Peter Parker seems sincere and genuine, and we have no reason to think that he is anything but a troubled student. He is always having problems with administration, with clerical errors, with grants and funding. And one of the bits I remember, one of my favourite scenes, is there is a bit where Joaquin is sat on a bench at campus having a breakdown. We don't know why, but that is, I think, when you really start to get the picture that Joaquin is a danger. Then in one issue, this is a continuing subplot over several issues, and actually both Spectator Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man. He is being assaulted by some guys in suits on campus, which Spider-Man is prepared to stop, but they go away before he can jump in. Spider-Man confronts them afterwards, thinking that they were mafia men, but they were actually FBI agents who were looking into Joaquin as part of an ongoing investigation. We have Joaquin thinking to himself about how they won't leave him alone and they won't catch him, and that they are all fools, blind, insensitive fools. Another issue opens with the same two federal agents looking for a killer. They have actually been benched and put on a cold case, hunting for the serial killer, Killer Fool. And they are then disintegrated by his ray gun. Killer Fool is back and he is taking care of these two fools who were interfering with his attempts at a peaceful and calm life. I feel like I'm talking about this story more than the issue I am actually looking at. Defense is contacted by Joaquin, and Defense takes time off his shift at Burger King to go and meet Joaquin Phoenix's mysterious contact, Lady Gaga. On the television interviewer before, that would have been Robert De Niro. No. In the sequel, it is Steve Coogan. Lady Gaga, she is apparently an old associate of Joaquin Phoenix. We have some in-jokes on this page about Killer Fool's name. She gives Defense, she gives Michael Douglas Killer Fool's gun, the powerful ray gun that disintegrates things. And Defense is conveniently assaulted by some neo-Nazi fuckwits with knives. And so he blasts them with the gun. And that is the first kill that the cover promised. Meanwhile, back in Spider-Man stories from the 80s, Killer Fool begins executing people related to the campus. the people responsible for Joaquin's troubles. Something that Peter Parker inadvertently put in his crosshairs. This leads to Spider-Man deducing that Joaquin Phoenix is Killer Fool and protecting his would-be prey. There is a great bit where a homeless man convinces Joaquin Phoenix that actually he is the biggest fool of them all, and Joaquin Phoenix is prepared to take his own life, but Spider-Man prevents that. And I fucking love that whole storyline. It is great because it allows Peter Parker so much compassion for a mentally struggling man. Killer Fool is a villain, but Peter Parker met him as a young man. And even in full Killer Fool mode, Peter Parker cannot help but see the young man in need of help. We see him again in that run. We see him being put into a psychiatric hospital. I think it is at the start of the next issue even. Felicity is also there. Big yes for Felicity. And then he appears in Captain America 320, where Captain America is trying to hunt Scourge. He was investigating any possibility of a connection to Killer Fool. Both this and those Spider-Man stories are tremendous. This issue, this series overall, is a slow burn story. It is about examining our characters and their personal philosophies and their psychological underpinnings. I recommend 7 thumbs up.